powerlifting used to be one of the most badass sports of all time, just dudes with beards lifting heavy shit. But along the way, I feel like we kind of lost the entire point of the sport, and powerlifting did go wrong. So, like, how did we go from this, all of these badass lifts to something like this, a sport where you're just optimizing the technique to an extreme, reducing every single possible factor to get the most amount of pounds on your lifts as possible. How did a sport go from something so badass to something like this? And is there a way that we can revert this change and make powerlifting great again? And there's a few things that you have to keep in mind when thinking about this. Like, first off, as the sport evolves and gets more popular, the sport is going to get optimized. And this is inevitable. This happens with every sport out there. Like, for example, MMA. In the early days of MMA, it was just dudes punching each other in the face until one of them dropped with zero defense, just trading punches and hoping they win. And now you see champions like Leon Edwards who just barely do enough to get by. They just barely skate by each and every round, and they just barely, beat you by points, but they're never trying to actually, do anything amazing, really. And that's just kind of something that will happen with sports that you have to accept. And the same thing happened with powerlifting. But how big of a deal is this? I'm calling it techniquifying of the sport, right? Because if you go to a local meet or like a state meet, you're not going to see guys with, or rarely going to see guys with benches like this, or squats like this, or deadlifts like this, right? This is pretty rare stuff, at least on a local and state level, or just like in your, regular powerlifting gym. People aren't this extreme. So you might say it's not that big of a deal, but it is a super bad look for sport as a whole if the best athletes, the people who hold the records, the people who are currently in first place winning national in the best meets, if these guys are just technique freaks whose lifts do look like this, and that kind of is a problem in some divisions. It's not bad at all divisions, right? But just some divisions, it's like, come on, are we really saying that this is a bench press? Like, are you kidding me? This is a deadlift. And sure, this isn't comp standard, right? But we're going to get into that later and how, you can potentially possibly fix some of these issues, right? And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how can we get powerlifting back to the badass sport that it once was? And the answer, we can't, dude. And I hate to break it to you, but this is not something that is just going to happen easily. And I don't think it's going to happen at all, right? Because if you have a rule set, right, in powerlifting that you have to follow in order for your lift to be good. And as long as you have that rule set, people are going to be exploiting that rule set to the fullest extent, if that makes sense. So even if we try to make the rules stricter, there are still going to be those people who are exploiting it to the maximum, trying to find any sort of loophole that they can, right? Like, for example, the IPF recently added elbow depth to hopefully help the range of motion on bench press. But it really didn't make that big of a difference, let's be real. And it just gave the judges one more thing that they have to focus on instead of other important aspects of the lift, right? And so what's the solution, right? Like, to stop a bench like this, what is the solution we could do? Well, we could reduce the maximum width grip, but that wouldn't make any sense because that would be unfair to some of the heavier guys, the bigger weight classes, and it probably wouldn't even affect some of the smallest weight classes, right? It's like, okay, what if we measure their arms, and then based on how long their arms are, they can go this amount wide? Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. That wouldn't work. That would never work, and that can't work. Especially on like a local or state level, how are the judges supposed to, determine if your arms are in the exact right place? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So we can't go back to how powerlifting once was, because there is no magical rule set that can make powerlifting badass once again and for all. But I want to go back to how big of a deal is this really, right? Because sure, some of the elite top level, bench presses or deadlifts or squats maybe are kind of pushing it on the technique side. But I feel like most are probably fine, right? Bench is the one where gets the most iffy, right? Because at the end of the day, you can't really cheat a squat or deadlift that much. Like, sure, you can do a sumo deadlift, but if we're talking about like IPF rules on a stiff bar, sumo deadlift really usually isn't that big of a deal unless you're like a genetic anomaly and have like crazy long arms. But then even still, conventional deadlift would probably be easier for you in that case too. But you can't really cheat a squat. Like, sure, there are these guys who have like crazy low bar, but that is a rare minority. And most lifters are not cheating the rules, they're not exploiting the system, I feel like. And there is a limit to using technique to your advantage and then exploiting technique, and that's one thing we have to keep in mind, right? And the IPF does a really good job with their rule set, and the USAPL of limiting that, using a stiff bar and having strict judges and strict rules. But what makes powerlifting have a bad look is the other federations like USPA, who allow a deadlift bar, and that's where things can get really iffy, right? And where powerlifting looks even worse is just like on the Instagram level. I call them Instagram lifters. They don't actually compete, but they use deadlift bars, they use figure 8 straps to reduce range of motion, and they put bumper plates on the outside of the bar to create more torque so the deadlift bar bends even more. Those guys make the sport look really bad because these guys are like barely doing lifts. Like this dude is like an Instagram lifter, right? And he's making the sport look really bad because he's not even doing a deadlift, man. Like, look at this. This is barely off the floor. He's doing like a knee extension essentially, and but no actual deadlifts in a competition are like this. And these squats, I mean, they're bad, but incredibly rare. And I really don't see many people actually doing them. And this evolution of the sport is just something you have to accept, right? Because there's nothing we can do about it. There's no magical rule set we can just put into place to stop people from benching like this, you know? So at the end of the day, it is what it is, right?